Welcome to Our College, Your Voices. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. On today's episode, I have 5 of Ivy Tech's internal experts with us to give us a little bit of a review of the legislative cycle that just ended at the end of April, as well as an overview of what that legislative cycle means to our college's budget, as well as some legislation that we've been watching all the way through the cycle. And I am excited to have this expert panel. They're a tough group to get together, so we are recording this one morning, and you're going to hear a couple folks in the same room and one person who's even doing this while driving. So we're going to focus on her safety, but you will hear a little audio quality difference in this episode, and I hope you'll bear with us to make sure that we could bring you this content. So with that, let's meet our panel. And the first member of our panel is Mary Jane Michalak. Hi, Mary Jane.
Hi, Kara. This is Mary Jane Michalak, Vice President for Government Relations.
Wonderful. Thanks, MJ. And Matt Hawkins. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning, Kara. I'm Matt Hawkins, Senior Vice President for Finance and Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you. Chris Lowery.
Good morning. This is Chris Lowery, Senior Vice President of Workforce Alignment for Ivy Tech.
Hi, Chris. And our intrepid traveler who's on the road, Katie Jenner. Good morning, Katie.
Good morning, Kara. Thank you for having me. I am Vice President of K-12 Initiatives and Statewide Partnerships.
Katie, I don't think we've ever had anybody recording while they're driving, so you just be careful, okay?
I will. Thank you.
Yep. And then finally, Sue Ellspermann. Good morning, Sue.
Good morning. Sue Ellspermann, President of Ivy Tech.
Wonderful. Thanks to all of you for joining me today and for having this conversation, because the legislative and budget process, I think, is a little mysterious to some people, but it's also so very important to us, and I know it's something I'm very curious about. So I'm going to start with MJ. MJ, part of your responsibility is to sort of guide the college through the legislative process. Can you give us sort of Legislative 101, what does the average faculty or staff member need to know about how Ivy Tech participates in the legislative process?
Sure, Kara. So Ivy Tech has a very important role at the State House because we are a statewide community college, obviously, but because so many of our students affect the legislature, 150 legislators have constituents who attend Ivy Tech, and that is probably the only college who might be able to say that, because we have locations in nearly all of the districts, or touching on the districts for the legislature. So my role during the legislative session is to be at the State House every day and make sure that I am tracking legislative bills, not just from a standpoint of higher education policy, but also any bill that might affect Ivy Tech operations and Ivy Tech as an employer. So when I'm looking at the legislation, I'm trying to figure out what kind of effect it will have on Ivy Tech as an employer from an operational standpoint, as well as what kind of effect will it have on our students. The length of the legislative process depends on the year. So this year was an odd number year, obviously. So this was a budget session, which means it's longer than the sessions that occur in even number years. So the General Assembly meets on a part-time basis, and this year they met from January through the end of April. Next year will be a short session in that we won't be discussing the biennial budget, so they will be meeting from January through March.
So if I can add on to that, the other piece about this legislative session, I'm sure Matt feels the same way, 55% of Ivy Tech's funding comes in the budget year, so it's a very critical time for us. Other higher ed institutions have a much smaller percentage of their budget coming from the General Assembly, and Indiana is an anomaly also in that we don't have, as a community college, property tax or local taxes helping to fund us. We are really a two-pronged approach as opposed to a three-pronged approach. So more than half of our budget comes out of the session, and thus we give it a lot of attention, making sure that we are able to provide the community college for all Hoosiers as needed with appropriate funding.
So Sue and MJ, you've hit a little bit on what my next question is, and it's directed at Matt to start with, and then I hope everybody else will add in. So Matt, this is a biennial budget year, so we set the budget every 2 years. Can you just give us an overview of the budget process? Because it's not strictly legislative, there are some other steps. Can you walk us through those steps?
Yeah, I would say the budget process starts internally really last year when we're gathering all of our data and submitting it to the Commission for Higher Education. And we're in the performance funding model at the state level with the 7 other public institutions. And at the same time, we're getting all of our capital requests together and any line item requests to kind of build a package that we're submitting to the Commission. And then the Commission comes out with a budget recommendation in fall of last year, so fall of the even years. And they compile everything and give that information to the legislature. So at the same time we're doing that, we were also doing an internal budget for the second year of the previous biennium. So we're really working on these 2-year bienniums at the state level, and then internally we have our own outcomes-based model for operating that we're doing on a yearly basis. So Indiana's unique in that the community college is also grouped in the same performance funding model as all of the other institutions, including research institutions. So that's a little unique. And one thing that I talk about a lot is that at a time when we're increasing the number of credentials that we're awarding, many people don't understand the huge lag in the performance funding data. So I'm trying to plan based on data that goes back to 2012. And last year was a good example when we implemented a salary plan that had only recurring increases for folks under 30,000 and then one-time payments. And we're basing some of those decisions on data that goes back 7 years. So it's quite a planning process looking at internal and external and making decisions for the long term based on that. The other thing that I get shocked looks sometimes is that the state agrees each biennium to fund Ivy Tech's debt for our capital. Many of our campuses, specifically the newer ones, have debt. And of that debt, we have about $350 million in debt. And it is Ivy Tech's debt. So we have to be responsible if a General Assembly did not fund it. They've never done that. But when I talk about bond ratings and things all the time, that's why that's such an important piece of all the conversations that we have.
And Matt, I know I've been standing with you when you're looking at some of the spreadsheets. You're not only looking 6 years back, you're also trying to then look 6 years ahead for the decisions that we're making today and how they might impact us in future years. And it's tough. Like I don't know how you keep all of that straight. So kudos to you for that and for helping to make those predictions, because I know they're tough. Sue, could you give us, as someone who's been in the legislature, could you give us a little bit of history on sort of how you see Ivy Tech in the legislative process historically, and then how you see Ivy Tech in the legislative process today? And I know others can jump in on that question, but Sue, if you'll start first and then others can jump in.
Well, as a legislator, when I was a legislator almost a decade ago, certainly all legislators have high interest in making sure that their constituents, both those high school, college-age students, as well as adults, have great career prospects before them. And I felt the same way as a legislator, that Ivy Tech, as well as all of the 4-year institutions, are important. But I will say that most of the legislators went to those 4-year institutions. So we always had to be careful, and still have to be careful, that we don't get taken for granted, because as a legislator may have gone to IU Kelley School or IU Law School, that becomes a little more central to their thinking, as opposed to the statewide institution that touches everyone, but may not have been the college that the legislator themselves attended. So I think that's one of the interesting undercurrents of representing Ivy Tech. Everyone likes us. We are well appreciated in the State House, sometimes not quite as well understood, particularly for legislators who have been there a while or come from my generation, where Ivy Tech was the technical college, not as familiar with it as a community college and the critical role we play, the importance on our 2+2 transfer programs. So I think what I know is Ivy Tech holds a good place in legislators' minds. They don't always understand us perfectly. And I do think that as the economy has come back and workforce has become one of the top handful of challenges the state has, Ivy Tech has certainly become a more important higher ed institution in the minds of all legislators and the governor as well.
And Sue, that's a great segue to one of the questions that I wanted to ask, so I'll insert it here. This is not necessarily a part of the legislative process, but it's still a part of how we interact with the state government, and that's the Governor's Workforce Council that I know you and Chris Lowery serve on, and then Katie Jenner, I know, is working very closely with some of that work. Could the three of you talk about if you saw any sort of interactions in the legislative process with that council, and anything about that Workforce Council that our faculty and staff should know at this point?
I'll just begin, and then I'll turn it to Chris and Katie. The governor's workforce cabinet was stood up for the purpose of bringing the right people around the table to talk about workforce, which included representatives from the governor's office, Department of Workforce Development, the Commission for Higher Education, Department of Education, Ivy Tech, Vincennes, and then the Career Talent, Blair Milo, the Secretary Milo's area, and then business, industry, and community representatives from across the state, really with the purpose of figuring out how we, in a strategic manner, move to ensure K-12 through higher education is helping to skill up Indiana's workforce to meet the demands of a growing economy with a need for ever more skilled individuals in those positions. So it has been operating now more than a year. Chris Lowery chaired one of the committees. Katie Jenner has been very involved with the high school dual credit CTE space, and the CTE space is very critical there. I'm going to let each of them talk more about their roles. I sit as a member and really want to help ensure that Indiana has good strategy moving forward.
Hi, Kara. This is Chris, and Sue framed it up really well. So if we look back at really the beginning of the Governor's Workforce Cabinet, it really was to put a focus at the very highest levels from a policy and practicality standpoint on workforce. There are 85 or 90,000 open jobs right now in Indiana, and that's not changed appreciably month over month. In addition to that, you look at it, and there are over 2 million Hoosiers with no post-secondary credentials. So some don't have a high school diploma, many do, and then some have a diploma in some college, but no degree or no credential. So you start looking at those things, and you really see the gap that exists in our economy. And it is, I think Sue referred to it, one of the key challenges our state faces right now. So with the work of the governor's cabinet, there were some key priorities, including how we would address career coaching and navigation. That was a team that I chaired. How we would look at CTE funding. I can share some of that, or Katie might want to. But the long and the short of it is the work that went on and continues to go on in the governor's workforce cabinet found its way to the legislature. In fact, it more than found its way. The recommendation and legislation that ended up resulting was House Bill 1002. The primary points of that legislation, most of which progressed successfully through the General Assembly, came from the governor's workforce cabinet that Sue was describing. So from policymakers to employers, that's really where it came from. And I think some of the really significant pieces that came in, really a combination of 1002, which was the workforce bill, and the budget this year included doubling of the funds for the Workforce Ready grants, again, those are dollars directly targeted towards skilling up Hoosiers to especially meet these middle skill jobs that just aren't getting filled. And we're having more of them, right? Because of retirement and because of growth in, enterprises around the state. Interestingly enough, at our own college, spring over spring, there was a 19% increase, but we can't let off the gas, and that's frankly not good enough. The funds that are now available, they've increased from $2 million to $4 million annually under the Workforce Ready grants. We have to really seize them as a college, and they've got to be front and center every day for us as a strategy. In addition to that, we're working closely with, and have been from the start, with the Commission for Higher Education and Workforce Development and Department of Workforce Development. And part of it that is not only the programs that are offered and how we administer those and so forth, but really in marketing this effort. Again, sort of a shot in the arm on this was a $750,000 appropriation to the Commission for Higher Education to promote Workforce Ready grants. So our team, Jeff Fanter's team, is working really closely with them. Increases in funding for the employer training grants, which again are really much more at the discretion of the employer and what kinds of programs and how those apply. But I guess the way I would put it is, while overall the budget presents challenges for us as a college, some of the opportunities for us that really came as a result of the governor's cabinet and then the work that the legislature did are specifically around employer training grant funds and continuing to work with our employer partners and ones we don't partner with yet on those, and then utilization of the Workforce Ready grants. I'll quit talking and let Katie chime in here. I was going to share some other points from some of that legislation, but I'll take a breath here.
I think Chris and Sue did a great job really framing it. I would echo, for the purpose of faculty and the listeners, it's really important. Probably the biggest theme of all that you should hear is House Bill 1002, Governor's Workforce Cabinet, other teams across the state, IDOE, CHE, DWD. The work is happening to try to build partnerships, seamless relationships between K-12, post-secondary, and industry. And you heard Sue and Chris both share that. But I would say that is, for me, the biggest theme that I saw. And in fact, if you look at the legislation, you see K-12, post-secondary, and industry side by side multiple times throughout that legislation and in conversation. The other thing that I would add to what Chris shared is specifically with regard to the CTE funding opportunities. And we're still, even after session, planning to work with the governor's workforce cabinet to further get some clarification on that, which again echoes the whole purpose of this movement, which is let's determine solutions as a state to overcome some of the challenges we have. And let's open up opportunities for students, for citizens of Indiana to improve the current landscape that we're in. So that's a quick overview, Kara, on House Bill 1002 and Governor's Workforce Cabinet efforts.
Katie, thank you so much for that. And to all of you, Katie, Chris, and Sue. I'm going to shift now actually to outcomes. We'll come back to House Bill 1002 for a moment, but we've done the overview of process. Now let's talk about results. And so, Matt, if you wouldn't mind starting, and anybody else can jump in here, can you give us an overview of the outcomes of the budget process through the legislature this year?
Well, I can from my perspective, and then I'm sure MJ can give a little more in depth. You know, we appreciate all of the funding from the General Assembly because at any level we're really talking kind of at the margins on how much the budget went up or down. I mean, the General Assembly is funding us at $1 million plus every day that we're open, so we appreciate it very much. The General Assembly goes through a process with the governor and the House and the Senate, and they all take the data from that 6-year period. So this time it was 12, 13, 14 versus 15, 16, 17, those fiscal years of data. And then they determine how much of the budget they want to be in performance funding. So if they want 6% or 7%, and then the next decision is how much of that funding do you want to reallocate from the previous year's base, and how much do you want to be new money? So because of our data, which was affected greatly by the enrollment increases after the recession and then decreases. The decreases in enrollment are just now starting to enter the performance funding model. So it made it very tough for us, regardless of how much new money went in or how much was reallocated, to gain much funding. So in the current biennium, which is fiscal 18 and 19, we received about 11 million new operating dollars. And in this upcoming biennium, so fiscal 20 and 21, in the first year, we lose about 1.4 million. And then the second year, we're up by about 1.9 million. So for a school the size of Ivy Tech, if you just factor in inflation at 2%, that's really a completely flat budget. And that is, again, the salary plan and the retirement plan changes for new hires. We did those things last year in preparation because we had a really good idea that this was going to happen based on the data. And the General Assembly essentially funded all of the capital priority 1 projects. They funded a few other things, but across higher ed, the priority 1 projects were funded, and ours was Columbus. So we're really excited about that. There were no new line items funded at any institution. So I would say it was a rough session for higher education because there was not a lot of new money in a very general sense, but Ivy Tech was extremely well prepared because of the finance team and the team's experience with all of the state's data and the processes at the state level. So MJ, you can probably add more to that.
Thanks, Matt. I guess the only thing that I would add is that overall, there is about 12% of the state's total budget that goes to higher education. So as Matt indicated, regardless of how the money is divided out amongst the institutions for performance funding, if the legislature does not allocate additional dollars and increase that 12%, the ability for Ivy Tech to get additional funds in the budget is limited, especially in a year when there were so many competing interests. We had a lot of money that needed to go towards the Department of Child Services because of issues that they have that have been covered at length in the news media. We had some additional money that needed to go to Medicaid. We had money that needed to be addressed towards K-12 education because of the many issues with teacher salaries that have popped up over the last year or so. Our legislature was very concerned about the possibility of teacher walkouts in Indiana like there had been in other states and what that would do both in terms of affecting our students' educational outcomes for the school year, but also from a standpoint of what does that say when they go to be reelected in the coming years. So there were many competing priorities for very little new dollars, and we have been on a trajectory of stable economic growth over the last several years, and all of the economic outcomes are pointing towards a recession in the future. So despite the fact that the state has a $2 billion surplus, there were many concerns about spending any new dollars this biennium because they want to make sure that over the next 2 years, if we go into a recession and state funding in terms of income, tax revenue, gaming revenue, et cetera, drops, in 2 years when they go to craft the budget for the next 2 biennium, they may have to dip into those reserves, and they wanted to make sure that there were sufficient reserves to address that in the future. So all of that to say, Ivy Tech faced a very high bar or hurdle, if you will, in getting additional revenue, as did all of the state institutions, because of all of the competing forces regarding the budget this year.
And so I know there's one more step in how we set our budget that's not necessarily tied to legislation, but that's the tuition, setting our tuition for the next couple of years. Matt, do you want to kick off talking about that process?
Sure. So after the legislative session ends, the Commission for Higher Education has 30 days to set a non-binding tuition recommendation, and that's confusing to some. In a lot of states, the Board of Regents, which is their commission essentially for higher ed, they set tuition rates at each institution. In Indiana, the commission makes this recommendation to all of the public institutions, and then the institutions have essentially 30 more days to hold a public hearing to say, here's our plan for these dollars. So what we do, we wait on the state budget to pass, and then we wait on the commission to come out with its recommendation. And this year it came out with a 1.65 recommendation for all the institutions. So we obviously looked at all of our internal budget models, our costs, and as the president said earlier, most of the other institutions, their budgets are made predominantly of tuition, and then they have some state funds. So at IU Bloomington, I think the number is closer to 12% of their budget, whereas ours is 55%. So what we did this year is just take the 1.65 and just assume that we agree with the commission's stance on it should increase by 1.65 a year. And we just applied that 1.65 across our budget. So it would increase tuition by that amount, but it would also increase the state operating dollars by that amount. So if you look at the first year when you lose $1.4 million in operating funds, there's a percent that we're looking at to increase that to 0. And then there's another percent that is 1.65 on the operating base and then on the tuition. So there's essentially 3 components of getting that entire budget up to 1.65% and then building the budget internally based on those dollars. And as you mentioned earlier, we're looking out, 2, 4, 6 years, because with the data lag, we know essentially where our data is going to be in the next biennium. So if we make salary decisions now, all of those salary decisions carry on forever, essentially, until there's turnover or staff changes or the college looks differently. So we have to plan based on our retirement plans and any other costs that we know are coming. So we're looking out really far when we pass these budgets. So in June, we'll take that to the Board of Trustees so they can vote on the salary plan, the tuition, and the internal budget for fiscal 20.
And based on when this episode drops, it may drop just before that board meeting. That board meeting, I think, is scheduled for June 6th. So there will be some information that will start to come out to our employee community about the salary after that. So that's the first time we can really talk about it publicly. MJ, MJ, I'll ask you to start this and then ask anybody else to add on to it. We've heard a little bit about House Bill 1002, and I want to ask Chris and Katie to dig into that a bit more here in a minute. But can you talk about other legislation that was important to us in this cycle and what some of the outcomes were from the legislative session?
Sure, Kara. Just to give some background before I dive into legislation specific to Ivy Tech, this is kind of a fun with numbers topic here. This legislative session, there were 1,358 bills and joint resolutions that were introduced. 293 of those passed. So the total pass rate of all introduced bills was about 22%. But that kind of gives you an idea of the number of bills that are filed and that go through the process in some way before the finale. In comparison, during a quote-unquote short session, last year there were a total of 901 bills that were introduced, and about 23% of those were passed and made it to the governor's office. So that just kind of gives you a sense for the number of bills that are filed and that we filter through to get down to the ones that are really going to be considered for a hearing and make it through the process. I'm not going to go through all of the bills, obviously, that we were tracking, but a couple of the bills that were specific to Ivy Tech, other than the state budget, which was our primary focus this year, House Bill 1002, which has already been discussed a little bit. The Commission for Higher Education always has at least one bill that addresses some type of higher education policy or fix that the CHE would like to see. This year they had two separate bills, and of course we closely follow those as they may affect Ivy Tech in terms of our students or operations. House Bill 1245 was their main bill for general higher education topics. That bill this year focused primarily on technical changes related to names of colleges that were changing, independent colleges that were changing. They needed to address the changes with the IPFW split between IU and Purdue. There was a provision added in there that repealed some old language related to Ivy Tech, that the language required Ivy Tech to enter into a lease with the owners of the Fort Wayne Regional Public Safety Center. Ivy Tech entered into that lease many years ago, and so the language really was no longer needed. So that language was pulled out. To that regard, that language in there was concerning at first because we had to go through and check with the state budget agency to make sure that that would not have an effect on any allocations that we receive for the purposes of paying that lease. So that was a bill that we were watching very closely to make sure no other language was added into that. The commission also asked for a financial aid related bill. That was Senate Bill 216, and that made some changes in conformities in the financial aid programs for veterans. So right now there are 6 or 7 different financial aid programs for veterans or public safety officers and their families. And so the commission wanted to streamline the language and kind of put those all in one piece of legislation, one statutory chapter, to make sure that they could streamline that and clarify the rules on those. So because we have many students who receive these funds, we also were keeping tabs on what was happening with that bill. Both of those were passed and signed by the governor. Another bill that we were keeping close tabs on was a bill that was requesting a study be done on the merger or the possibility of combining the workforce cabinet and the Commission for Higher Education, the State Department of Education. So what ended up happening with that bill is that there was a language that requires or urges the Legislative Council, rather, to assign this topic to an interim study committee, which essentially is a group of legislators who get together during the recess of the legislative session. So usually it starts in August and goes until October or November. They meet several times to discuss and research further topics related to whatever was in statute. So in this case, they will be looking at, if it's approved, they will be looking at integrating the membership of all of those entities, so the State Board of Education, the Workforce Cabinet, in the interest of aligning the state educational system, looking at the composition of the State Board of Education, the Workforce Cabinet, the Commission for Higher Education. So we were keeping tabs on that bill. Another bill that we were keeping tabs on related to a workforce diploma reimbursement program, which was intended to assist adults who are 22 years of age or older in getting their high school diploma, and then providing funding for this alternative diploma program. The interest Ivy Tech obviously has in that is that's a population that we serve and serve well. So if these individuals can get their high school diploma, how can we partner with these entities to offer credentials when they complete that diploma, or in addition to them taking those courses. So that's just a few of the bills. Obviously, there were several other bills. One I might mention related to public safety officers. Specifically, we were looking at volunteer firefighters. Representative Randy Fry was championing a bill that would provide a scholarship to volunteer firefighters and other public safety officers to attend Ivy Tech as a recruitment and retention tool for volunteer firefighter departments as well as other public safety entities. Ultimately, that bill did not go through. However, there was a provision added to House Bill 1002 that requires the Indiana Commission for Higher Education to consider the public safety needs of the state when determining programs for the Workforce Ready grant. And that language was put in specifically to address the public safety needs that Representative Fry brought to the attention of the legislature through that volunteer firefighter bill. So there is a possibility that public safety programs, specifically those that would lead to fire safety certification, et cetera, would be eligible for Workforce Ready grant in the future. And we are working with the Commission for Higher Education to go through the process of determining how that might get approved.
Katie and Chris, could I ask you to talk just a little bit more about House Bill 1002 and sort of what its impact to us is, or the potential impact?
Sure. And MJ, thank you for mentioning. I had really 3 bullet points that I was going to kind of dig into, so I'll springboard off maybe a couple of the things that MJ mentioned. One is around the workforce diploma system, the $1 million per year that's been allocated for that. You know, we have a real great opportunity that MJ was alluding to there to partner with folks we're already working with. You know, I think of, as an example, you know, folks at the Excel centers and other places to just build on that. And, you know, we see that working in various parts of the state. I think the latest example is the expansion that's taking place in Bloomington in the partnership between the Excel Center, Ivy Tech, the Cook Group, and others. So we've got the opportunity to really leverage against that, not only that funding, but really that culture that's being created. One of the other things I was going to mention is around the $1 million that's been allocated per year for the career coaching and navigation system. These are funds that are going to be made available in a grant format, the rules of which are yet to come, and we'll be working really closely with the state. That recommendation came out of the team that I chaired on behalf of the cabinet, the workforce cabinet. And as anyone listening to this who's followed what we're now doing with our career coaching and employer connection strategy as a college can see, the congruence that exists there. So we'll be working closely both with the state and then with our own teams that are likely to be in the alpha, or that are going to end up being in the alpha phase of the rollout of the career coaching and employer connections strategy, to make sure we're linking up there, helping to form or helping to leverage the partnerships that have been formed at the local level. And, you know, one of the things I was going to add, and I don't know that it's really been mentioned here today, is that within a lot of the discussions this year and specific to legislation, there is much more of a view, it appears, and movement toward longitudinal outcomes, right? And by that, we mean having institutions, whether that's in K-12, whether that's Ivy Tech, whether that's others who are receiving, state funds, to have an eye toward what the long-term outcomes are beyond the completion or awarding of a credential. So that's going to continue to, I think, increase in the conversations with policymakers. MJ may want to say something additional about that, but we're even seeing it in the accountability panel discussions that'll be forthcoming for K-12. I think a number of policymakers have seen that we have been moving in that direction, whether that's looking at placements and work and learn experiences, what we're doing with the CCEC, looking at wage outcomes. That's just going to continue to increase at sort of the forefront of what policymakers are thinking in really the world of education and workforce.
And to add on to what Chris shared, and I first want to, Kara, just share with you and our faculty and staff listening. Being brand new to Ivy Tech, I was so impressed with the work from MJ, Matt, Sue, Chris, and others during the session, and the reputation really that Ivy Tech has. People do want Ivy Tech to no doubt be a part of the conversation, but Ivy Tech is really seen as a key to our state solution with the workforce challenge we have ahead of us. But since MJ and Chris dug into some of the policy themes, I just want to share some of the overall K-12 to post-secondary to industry themes that I either read through legislation or heard and am still hearing in conversation. So a couple things. One, the push is really to move away from random acts of dual credit throughout our state. So 2/3, Commissioner Lubbers just shared fairly recently that 2/3 of our high school students leave with dual credit. The question and the opportunity is, does that dual credit equate to anything? Does it equate to any currency that the student can leave high school having their diploma plus maybe a CT or even better, a technical certificate, that first year? We do have some school districts doing associate degrees, but that is no doubt a moving piece that our Ivy Tech team should be aware of, and also a complement to the work that is happening already throughout our state. Last year alone, Ivy Tech served 61,000 high school students, awarded 400,000 credits, and we also awarded 1,000 completions. And the opportunity now is how to further help students with earning the additional completions. If you take 400,000 credits that we awarded, divide that by 30, which is our average TC, we should be over 13,000, or could be maybe over 13,000 completions if it's just student to student. But at least we should work to increase that. The second thing, and kind of how to do that, is, in this goes back to a previous question, the CTE team's work on the governor's workforce cabinet. And we saw some of this in our hearing conversations about the importance of the curriculum alignment being backwards designed, what that means is, if we are hearing from industry and their ever-changing environment that they have, then Ivy Tech's curriculum is obviously aware of the ever-changing industry environment. And then K-12 would model off of post-secondary's curriculum. So we're already, as a result, not only of legislative session, but also these other conversations, having some of our Ivy Tech faculty and other team members meeting with the Department of Education, for example, the Commission for Higher Education, to further backwards design and align K-12 to this post-secondary work, which should allow more students to earn a technical certificate by high school graduation. Thirdly, and in addition to the real emphasis on credential earning by high school graduation, and also piggybacking off of what Chris said with the longitudinal data, outcome focused and helping students to not only earn a credential, but also another outcome would be the work-based learning. Work-based learning, if you read, which all of you are welcome to, it's accessible online, House Bill 1002, in your time, you will see work-based learning sprinkled throughout the legislation. And so I think a question for our campus teams is, how might we facilitate opportunities for students that are not only credential earning, but also have a paralleled work-based learning experience? And again, we have some best practices already happening throughout the state. We should learn from each other and continue to partner. Finally, it's echoing back where I started, which is Ivy Tech is key for Indiana for this work to happen. And every person, regardless of what your role is on your campus, can help influence and impact students and citizens in our state. So love being a part of this team. It was a pleasure to enjoy and join this session with team members, and glad to work towards the solutions and implement the solutions now that are right before us. So again, thank you.
Katie, that's a good segue to our ending today. So I'm just going to ask Sue if you would, any final thoughts, and anybody else can add into that, but sort of what your takeaway is from this session, if you don't mind, Sue.
Thank you. And Katie said it well, but reflecting probably Matt and MJ and I, Katie and Chris, it was budget-wise, it was okay. We're well prepared to deal with the budget that we have. It gives us lots of opportunity to earn our way to great success as we bring more high school dual credit completions, dual enrollment completions, the Workforce Ready Grant, as we call next level jobs, as we bring more Hoosiers who should be getting that additional credential to be successful in the workforce. We earn those additional funds back. And most importantly, that never before has the General Assembly affirmed in a stronger way that Ivy Tech is doing what it needs to be doing to move Indiana forward. Our big goal of 50,000 completions aligned with workforce needs is absolutely what the state of Indiana needs, and the General Assembly has set us up to earn that and move that direction, and bringing its legislation to direct towards those outcomes that Chris talked about. And we have the right team to do the work. So I'm excited as we go into this next 2 years. We are in a good position, and we will continue to do what Indiana needs us to do. And I'm so thankful, as Katie said, for the team that we have across every one of our campuses, really aligned to ensure that Indiana succeeds.
Well, thanks to the panel for that great conversation. As you know, every episode ends with a call to action. For this episode, we're going to link to House Bill 1002, as well as some of the other resources that were highlighted in this episode in our show notes. So I urge you to take a look at those, and particularly to read through House Bill 1002, because there is a lot of impact to Ivy Tech potentially in that bill. Thanks to everybody again for joining this episode of Our College, Your Voices. I especially want to thank the members of today's panel, Mary Jane Michalak, Matt Hawkins, Katie Jenner, Chris Lowery, and Sue Ellspermann. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. You can always connect with me on Twitter. I'm at KNMTweets. Our producer is Ann Penny Valentine. Ann is on Twitter at IndyPenny. You can reach us by email with show ideas on how you've used this information in the show, or just say hi. Our email address is ourcollegeyourvoices@ivytech.edu. Again, that's ourcollegeyourvoices@ivytech.edu. You can also leave us a voicemail at 317-572-5049. Tell us something we got wrong in the show. Tell us something we got right. Tell us about a way you've used a call to action, or just call to say hi. Again, that number is 317-572-5049. Our website is ivytech.edu/podcast. Production assistance for this and every episode is provided by Becky Campbell, Sarah DeWitt, and the Ivy Tech Community College marketing team. Our podcast concept is by Matthew Pittman. Theme music, post-production services, as always, provided by Jen Eads at the Brassy Broadcasting Company. We will see you next time on Our College, Your Voices.